Okay, so fractures. One of the reasons why I thought of you when I thought about what I wanted to share about my story was because of the idea of fractures. Like I saw the exhibition, I was really excited. I was like, Women's Museum doing something.
Yeah.
And then I saw that it was you. And we've known each other a really long time.
A very long time, yeah.
Like primary school, a long time. And
Yeah.
in that time, we've had like so many iterations of ourselves.
Yeah.
I now call myself a storyteller rather than a writer. In some way, it's because maybe I'm a little bit apprehensive about calling myself a writer yet. What are you calling yourself?
I think I also am a storyteller, actually. But yeah, I'm a singer-songwriter, I guess that's what I'm calling myself. But kind of at the core of it, there's this word that I like that I learned from, what is that book? With Aminata Diallo, and anyway, it's by Lawrence Hill, and they have like jellies in their villages. These are people who carry the stories of the people along, so you can be a jelly across generations for like 50, 60 years, and you carry the history of the people and pass it on, and that is your responsibility. So yeah, I like that word, and that's what I feel like I am.
Wow, it's kind of like a griot, right?
Yes, I agree.
That's amazing. And again, I see the symbiosis because I'm writing historical fiction.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to go back in time to excavate our histories and give the women that lived then sort of a voice through my own voice, if that if that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah. How are you excavating our histories? How are you getting that story from the past and bringing it into now?
I am trying to link, so like create a bridge between our voices now and the voices of my ancestors. So I feel like our voices should not be so different, but because of the break or the fracture in the passing on of information, our voices are so different. We are not rooted in our ancestors' voices for obvious reasons. Our foundations were kind of, rubbished, if that's the word. And we had to start making our foundations from somebody else's history, somebody else's identity, somebody else's idea of self. So for me, I'm searching for that voice, those stories that my grandmother and her grandmother told, and what that sounds like, what that feels like, just even the words that they used, what they talked about. So that's what I'm doing, and trying to connect it to what matters to me now, the situations I find myself in, the feelings that I feel, and kind of linking the two and trying to make something that is unique and that sounds and feels like home. Yeah.
But how does it manifest? Because for me, it manifests with trying to use local languages in amongst the English, and like stealing words from Ila or Tonga or Kaonde or whatever it is, and then placing them in there and just expecting people to know, to just absorb them and know the full story, even if they don't know the individual words. How is it manifesting for you? Are you using different language? Are you, the melody is different? Is the way you're creating different?
So for me, from the beginning, I've always had like local language infused in my music. But now I'm going for a feel, actually. I'm going for the hums, the chants, the stories themselves, like the words, the meanings of things that were used. So even with the creative process, I I'm looking for that. For example, the last piece that I did for Fractures was inspired by a word, echishimba, which is like a charm, a lucky charm. So that was my starting point. It was about Ichishimba and what that means and what that means to people, what it was used for, what it was made of. So it kind of translates into a feeling and like a whole idea about what a thing is and what it means to me and how I can incorporate that into my day-to-day and how I can see it in my day-to-day.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk about creation. For me, when particularly with this story, the first thing that came to me was I wanted to write the story of the mother. So it was the mother who came to me first. Actually, it wasn't the mother. It was the father. I wanted to tell the story of the father, but I wanted to tell it through the eyes of the mother. And then when I started writing the story, the mother said, no, I have my own story to tell.
Okay.
So I'm not going to allow my husband to hijack my story.
My story, yeah.
And so she kind of told her husband's stories, but it was her story and her daughter's story.
Yeah.
One of the big themes is for me that fracture between the mother and the daughter and how they think so differently about what their lives should be. Yes, they're both based in the past, but she's much more of a modern woman than her mother, and so they're kind of at loggerheads because of that. This exhibition was also all about fractures. First of all, just explain, like, in your mind, why do you think it was called Fractures? What was that about?
So we have a wonderful curator of the whole project was Ranji Chona, and she's the one who came up with the term fractures. It's all about kind of filling that space in between the past and the present. So it's the fractures between what we do now, how we do it, and what was done before and how they did it. So I guess, like I said, it's kind of trying to make that leap from the past to the present and finding the common ground and not making it seem like it's so far away or so distant from us. So that's, I guess, why it was called Fractures.
And then the method of creation was really interesting. For me, when I'm thinking up a story, I go days and days just like daydreaming, thinking, wondering, and then I sit in front of a blank sheet and just write, and whatever comes out, comes out.
Yeah.
How did you guys come up with the music that you did for Fractures?
Just to say about when you're talking about the characters kind of speak to you and say what they want to say and do, that's very interesting, because I don't think I've ever sat down with like a storyteller and had a conversation about how they create, and you sound like a crazy person, but that's nice. I like it.
There are a lot of people in my head.
Inside your head.
Yes.
That's very interesting. For me, I guess it's the voices that come. It's the melodies that come when you look at an object. So for this project, so Fractures is actually a continuation of a different project that we did, not different, but earlier project, which was called Fabricated Stories. And that started the whole thing going. It's a collaboration between the Women's History Museum and the Museum of World Histories in Sweden. And it essentially is about repatriating the knowledge and the items that are sitting in that museum and bringing them back here. But because that process is taking so long and there's so much resistance to, them sending the stuff back, Women's History Museum thought, let's use technology. We have technology at our disposal, so people can still access these things digitally. So now anybody can have access to the archives of the photos of these objects, a little bit of the metadata behind these objects, what they were made from, what they did, how they were made, and things like that, and who used them. So that's how Fractures came about. So we were using inanimate objects, and typically for a singer, songwriter, I respond to energies, I respond to situations that I've witnessed, I respond to stories that my friends are telling me, or things that I've seen happening in their lives. And a lot of the time it's a feeling, it's sadness, it's happiness. And having this inanimate object that couldn't inform me with its life, I had to kind of infuse life, which was very weird but very interesting. It was a challenge that it opened up a different way of storytelling and a different part of my creativity, which I really love. Yeah, so we created from those inanimate objects, and we had to do a lot of research into things that could inform the storytelling. So what the pieces were made of, for example, like the chishimba is made of an animal horn, and it was hollowed out, and also they added like a bird from the sea. That was something unique that they thought would bring more power to it, and those kinds of things. So what it was used for, it was used as a lucky charm, or actually somebody who came to the exhibition on opening night said he had heard that sometimes it was used as a bad luck charm. So there's all those kinds of things that inform the storytelling for me. So I had to now tap into that different kind of creating.
Yeah, I like the fact that some random person came, because there's this collective knowledge, right?
Yeah.
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 Something that you just said that was interesting to me is the fact that this one object had two different sort of meanings. And I guess it depends if you're the evil one or if you're the one who wants to be protected.
Yes.
My story is called A Sacred Place.
Yeah.
And I named it A Sacred Place because it happens in one place. Mm-hmm. It's in a kitchen. Mm-hmm. We obviously didn't have like kitchens back in the day, but we had insakas, and this place was used as a kitchen.
Yeah.
But I thought of it as sacred because you could only really have one master of a kitchen at a time.
True. That's true.
And so these two women couldn't coexist in that single space.
Yeah.
And so again, it's like taking an inanimate thing, you know, like as a kitchen, and giving it life through placing a story within it.
Yeah. I really loved the story, but mostly I don't read short stories because they're just like, oh, okay, we're done. And at the end of it, I was like, oh, where did she go? You know, like, what happened to her? But yeah, I really enjoyed it. You have a very vivid voice in terms of what you're trying to do. I really appreciated that. It came alive, and I could see her and her mother, and I could relate to those kinds of tensions, you know, that mothers and their daughters have, and especially in that space where, like you say, there can only be one mistress or master of that place. So, yeah.
And it's interesting. I know you asked me before as well, like, where did she go?
Yeah.
And what happened to her? I also have a love-hate relationship with short stories because of that. But I think one of the things that they do is they sort of broaden your imagination because they don't tell you the whole story. They don't tie it up in a bow. And so she could have gone anywhere. Where she could have gone could have been better than where she is, or it could be worse. Yeah. Just like any other time we're moving through life, we don't know what's actually really going to happen. So, okay, so a lot of my stories are in the same universe. Mm-hmm. When I say universe, they're on Earth. They're on Earth, but they're kind of in the same world. Okay. But a lot of the time, I will sort of think about women's stories, right? And often it's not younger women; it's women who are older. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's women who are past a certain age and people start thinking of them as witches because that is what happened in society. Yeah. Sometimes it's women who are maybe just married and then trying to figure out if they're happy with their lot in life. But I just think it's really important to tell stories about different women in different stages. I know that right now there's this whole reclamation of women's voices that are above a certain age,
Yeah.
edging towards middle age.
Yeah.
You know, trying to stop that erasure that sometimes happens after a certain time.
Yeah.
Yeah, people often say that women over a certain age start to become invisible. So if you're not a mother, you've done your mothering, and you're not a grandmother, you're really not of use to anybody, so they don't actually see you.
Yeah.
You know, how do you? I know that you don't sing exclusively about women, but you are a woman of a certain age. How do you sort of tie that kind of narrative into your work, or how do you see yourself within the business? You know, you're not emerging. You've been around for quite a while now. Yeah. How do you see yourself sitting within there? Do you feel like you still have something to say? What do we have to say?
And that's interesting. I was thinking about that a little earlier, in that more than just creating now, I'm getting people asking to speak to me about creating. So I was thinking, oh, right, I'm at that age where I have kind of enough knowledge to know, and for people to want to know what I know about knowing. So yeah, you're right. Women especially tend to become invisible as they get older, or useless, in that, you know, people think, oh, she's past her mothering years, especially if she doesn't have a child. It's like, oh, but for me, I guess it's about speaking confidently, whatever phase I'm in, and not being apologetic about being almost 40. You know what I mean? Like, I like it. I take less rubbish now from anything and everyone. Like, I'm more comfortable in my skin, and sitting in this skin I enjoy it more than I did when I was younger. And there's nothing wrong with being younger. Even that is good, and you get your lessons then, and you make your mistakes then, and that's what's supposed to happen, and that's how it's supposed to be. So in terms of kind of putting a time frame into which somebody can be productive or useful, I don't subscribe to that at all. So I move exactly how I want to move in the world, and confidently at that, so that the next generation coming are able to see that I'm unapologetic about being 40. And when I'm 50, I will be unapologetic about that too, and 60 and 70 as well, because I will have other things to bring and to give to the community, to the world.
Yeah. And also, more importantly, for our purposes as creatives, if as a person you care less about what people think, then also as a creative you care less.
Yeah.
So like when I'm writing my stories, yes, sometimes I will write something that I think, oh, do I dare put this out there? But more often than not, I'll be like, yes, put that in the story. It's fine. It's the, you know, that's my opinion or my people's opinion or whatever it is, the opinions of the characters, and like put it out there. And so it adds something to the craft.
And that is the thing about fearing what people say. I mean, it's fine to care what people say. We live, you know, in a society, but it's the fearing what people will think and say that is the problem. And the problem with that is that some people get left behind, some people get, you know, forgotten. And if you are able to tell the story of, you know, that person who wasn't so cookie cutter or whatever, I don't believe that anybody can be the only in the world.
Don't you think the world is missing out on really good stories or really good music or whatever it is, because they're actually excluding, you know, because everybody wants to sell something young and sexy, right?
Yeah.
But the young and sexy, just like really new wine, doesn't have as much depth.
No.
I mean, that's just the truth of it, right? And so they're excluding all these stories that could be so much more layered.
But also, if you don't tell the stories, people tend to feel lonely, and that is not true. You are not alone, you know, in whatever you're going through. If your back aches, you're not alone. You know, people have backaches all the time, but if nobody is talking about it, then you think to yourself, oh my goodness, why am I so weird? Why do I have a backache? You know?
Yeah.
So in telling those stories, you kind of bring people in and allow people to accept who they are and what they are and be able to deal with it in a community. We're not, you know, islands.
Yeah, we're not islands. And that duality actually is a little bit of what happened with me when I started trying to write this story.
Yeah.
Was because I started from the perspective of the mother.
Right.
And she's a battered woman. And so I thought I would think one way about how she thought about herself, right? But then once the daughter's story came in, and then they started having to have that conversation between them, you realize that there's no one common solution with everyone, you know. And in a world right now where sort of because of social media or whatever, everybody just thinks there's one way of thinking, there's one way of being, and if you don't think the way we think, then your thoughts are not valid. You'll be cancelled, sort of thing. And one of the things that I have discovered through storytelling is that because of the empathy that can be elicited by telling different people's stories, you learn that actually there's no one way of thinking, and all these different ways of thinking are valid and sort of teachable moments.
I was just about to ask you actually that, for example, with this woman that you say you thought you would think about her a different way, how does that kind of inform now the way you move through the world? Does it, or do you just like kind of put her on the page and then move on like, oh, that's a story, I told it, and none of it kind of seeps into your day-to-day or the way you treat people different or things like that? Or do they actually kind of, do you learn lessons from your characters?
Yeah, I think it enables me to have more empathy. And I think in general, I love fiction. I hardly ever read anything that's not fiction. And I love fiction because of the empathy that it's able to elicit. Like, you can read a story from the point of view of a serial killer and have empathy for the serial killer without necessarily saying it's right to kill people, sort of thing, you know? So in the same way that fiction impacts the reader, it also impacts the writer in that same way, because you're drawing the story out, maybe even more so.
Interesting.
Futures.
Yeah.
Since we had like fractured pasts and we've been trying to fuse everything together, the past and the present, maybe we can try and tack the future into that. My storytelling career, I need to stop putting that in air quotes. My storytelling career is only just starting. I've been thinking about the possibility of getting a story and creating something dramatic out of it. So like the filmmaker in me is kind of bubbling under with ideas. I really like the idea of being a playwright. Oh, I would love to be call myself a playwright. So I'm toying with the idea of getting a short story, maybe not this one in particular, but getting a short story and making it into a musical. So I might be knocking on your door again at some point.
My hand is up. That would be amazing. Do it.
What's in your future?
I have no idea. But like on a larger scale, I really hope that this kind of catches on, this thing of drawing from the past so that we can connect the past and the present, and therefore have a future that is grounded in the past and all the good stuff and all the bad stuff. Because the stories are never just good or just bad. They are whole things. And I guess because of where we're coming from in terms of colonization and things like that, a lot of who we are, our identity, was considered bad. And so we sit more heavily and comfortably in a foundation that is not even really ours. So going forward, I really want this to catch on where when we're telling our story or when we are voicing whatever it is that we're voicing, our voices are based off of Africanness and Zambianness and our grandmothers and our grandfathers and all those people who birthed us, really, you know.
I think that's so important because one of the things that I've found while trying to do like research for historical fiction, obviously it's fiction, but it has to be based on some sort of fact.
Yeah.
And there just aren't many stories by ourselves out there. So a lot of the fact that I'm basing my stories on are white people that came to study us in the same way that people would study animals. So they did ethnographic study. And I say it like that, and it sounds really harsh, but the kind of language that is used when you read those texts are very, like, you know, we're sitting here watching them, you know, as
very
though
dispassionate.
very dispassionate, like they're looking at beings in a zoo or something, you know. And so again, like I said, attaching humanity to ourselves, and like you say, being grounded in the fact that we've existed as cultures, as traditions and nations, you know, for hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, we didn't just begin to exist when colonization began or when it ended, and unfortunately so many of our stories start when they discovered us, you know, kind of like, as you know, in the same way that the Victoria Falls exists,
was
only,
discovered.
only because it was discovered. In that same way, our stories only exist unless we do something about it, only exist from the time that we were discovered. And
like they say, I mean, if you can only tell the story from your point of view. And so if your point of view is, I conquered these people, I don't even blame them for telling stories the way they do. But now we're at a time where we must now tell our stories. Like I think we're kind of in a good place where it's not so far away, like it's not so far behind us, but we're in a place where we can kind of detach ourselves a little from that story of being, you know, taken over and colonized. We can start to emerge as ourselves, and the more we do that, the more we become confident in our own voices, and also trust our own voices, and trust that when our old grandparents who, you know, go into the garden and pick up like a little plant and say, take this if you have a headache or whatever it is, you can trust that that is coming from a place of love and no one is trying to bewitch you, you know what I mean? As opposed to, like I said, when the protagonist came and that was strange to them, they just immediately branded it as a terrible thing. When you are the protagonist, you understand things differently. You understand why things are being done that way. So, let's do that. Let's tell our stories. And as you were saying that the ideas are coming now about what you want to do with these stories. That's what happens when you begin to tell your stories. The possibilities now begin appearing. And so we must continue to tell our stories. And yes, when you are unpracticed in doing something, it's bad. And I say that like it's not of a high quality, but you must continue to tell your stories so that you gain confidence, you gain knowledge, you gain skill in doing that.
Because with every story you get better.
Yes.
And I like the power in that, because right now we're in a space where we're fighting for restitution, we're fighting for reparations. People are trying to get things back from the British Museum and from museums in Germany and America, and people are giving back fingers to Africa, like just all sorts of things are happening. And I like the idea that we can actually give ourselves reparations by telling our own stories. That's one way of giving to ourselves, and not again waiting to be given to by people from wherever.
That's beautiful. I'm going to steal that in all my conversations going forward. Giving ourselves reparations. That's amazing. So true.